if you don't understand anything, you need me to repeat it, especially when we get to some of the artificial intelligence stuff. I will be going through some, not really math, but some pretty sophisticated ideas. So this is meant more as a teaser to introduce you to a big range of exciting ideas, all the way from animals to artificial intelligence. Okay, so let me make sure I'm set up. Cool. Okay, so effective altruism is defined in a few ways. It's often defined around doing the most good. Sometimes it's defined around finding the best ways to help others and putting those into practice. I personally like to think of it as a companion or a support social movement. So it's a meta project in many ways, where meta means something above and outside, as opposed to mesa meaning something inside or below. It supports and finds and addresses the world's most pressing problems. Where pressing problems, we'll talk about what defines these, but are largely thought of in terms of their scale, the amount of moral value at stake, their neglectedness, so how few people are working on them. That gets a little complicated because sometimes if too few people are working on something, you can't really get critical mass. Maybe there's not an organization that you can work for at the time, and you'd have to start everything up yourself. So that's a bit complicated, but in general, neglectedness means you can have more of an impact. And tractability. So to what extent can actions taken on that actually address the issue? When we start talking about some of the world's most pressing problems in the far future, so thinking about how we can improve what society is going to look like decades or centuries from now, that might be really difficult. And that might be a reason against it. And you have to weigh these different factors against each other. So I co-founded a group called the Sentience Institute. We're one of these effective altruism organizations. We're relatively small. We're focused on the project of ensuring the best future for all sentient beings, primarily through moral circle expansion. That's what those little concentric circles refer to here. We've been historically focused on animal advocacy. So when you think about ways to do the most good, it's often natural to think of the sentient beings alive today who are most neglected and most mistreated, many of whom are non-human animals. Thanks for the link. And we've transitioned about around 2020 to focusing on artificial intelligence. So it's kind of a bit difficult to explain all the different things we do, but in general, we're on this effective altruism mission, and we've mostly worked on animal and AI issues. I did do a book in 2018. So I should say that I'm 29, so I'm a bit old, but not that old. And I think y'all are part of a really exciting generation that's stepping into these new areas, and you have your own opportunities like these. So when I started doing research on the most effective ways to help animals, there was a lot of exciting research, a lot of exciting ideas, but nobody had really distilled them and put them into something like a book format. So I was able to sort of write one of the first books on effective altruism in animals. There were several kind of evidence-based advocacy books, but the first one that was clearly identified with effective altruism when I was 25. So this was the culmination of my research and some others in that area. About when this book came out, well, actually before it came out, because you write a book and then you wait for it to come out, I started working on AI and some other issues. But I'm still very interested in the ideas. I think animal stuff is super exciting. We'll talk about some of the most exciting areas as well. And yeah, I'm like very happy with how the book turned out. It got a lot of coverage. You can look into it online. Yeah. So as a starting point for this, I want to introduce a few statistics. I am a statistician, as they say, I guess, technically. So first, 5 to 7% of US adults identify as vegetarian. This is often thought of as a new thing. My opinion is actually that this number has stayed about the same since 2000. We saw a lot of social change in the 80s and 90s. We've seen things like Lisa Simpson on The Simpsons be a vegetarian. We saw some environmental reports in the early 2000s. But I think really what we now think of as, every once in a while you meet a vegetarian or a vegan came around at that time. We have less data on this in other countries around the world. India might be as high as 30%. Many countries are hovering around 0% or 1%, where it's still somewhat foreign to the culture. But this rate's relatively low. But I want to tee up a question, and I'd love if you put in chat a percentage between 0 and 100% for what percentage of US adults you think would agree with the statement. So really the way we ask the survey is we put the statement in front of people and say, do you agree with it or not? We have a little scale from strongly agree to strongly disagree. So a percentage that agree with the statement, I support a ban on slaughterhouses. Put that in chat. Feel free to send it to everyone. 735. Someone messaged me 25, 80, 12.5, 50 for women, 10% for men, 20, 15. Okay. Pretty in line with a lot of guesses that I've heard. It turns out, and we've done this in 2017, we've asked it, 2019, 2020, and 21. In 2021, most recently, 49%. So this is surprising to most people. Some of y'all got pretty close to it, so that's great. But this is a lot higher than the percentage who are vegetarian in the general population. Yeah, wow. This is surprising, and it's really exciting from an effective altruism perspective, because a lot of what we're looking for when we're effective altruists is where the levers on society. So where are the ways in which you can, I don't know if y'all are taking physics, but find a fulcrum or find some push and pull on society that kind of moves more than you think it would, or maybe some potential energy locked up somewhere that you can utilize. A lot of effective altruism is about identifying these. So not just the world's most pressing problems, but the most pressing, or sorry, most exciting solutions and avenues to approach those. And I think this is one of those, because while we don't have many vegetarians and people are in general pretty opposed to changes in their individual diet, I should say there are some countries where this works better. Again, I mentioned India. So you have religious reasons sometimes. In Israel, they've actually gotten a lot of traction because they're very used to religious diets, not vegetarianism or veganism as religious diet, but in general, like, weird things with their daily consumption. This is an exciting opportunity for what I call institutional change, which we'll return to later. Okay, so you don't have to put a percentage for this one. You can if you want. But the factory farming of animals is one of the most important social issues in the world today. That's 54%. So even a little higher. The most important social issues. This is really interesting. I think this actually tells us something broader about surveys and about the way people answer questions. I think they see most important, and they see an issue that's important to them, and they just kind of say check mark, yes, thumbs up. They don't think through, okay, let me weigh all these options together. They don't have like a specific number in mind for the most pressing issues. But the interesting thing about this statistic is it was 69% when I first started giving these presentations when we ran the survey in 2017. It actually seems to be sort of with the Trump era, when you saw a division in a lot of US political discourse, where I think people started prioritizing certain issues more. So this survey data can teach us a lot, I think, about the general political climate and how people think about particular EA issues. Okay, another one, animals deserve the exact same rights as people to be free from harm and exploitation. This is a pretty radical statement of animal rights, the exact same rights. Again, think about how carefully do people read things on surveys. That's 32%. So lower, but again, a pretty radical statement. And that's certainly, at least 3 times as high as a percentage of vegetarians. I should say this one actually, and the one I'll show after the last one, are not our data, they're Gallup's. So one thing you have to think about in surveys is the context in which people are asked these things. This one's a different context than the others. So yeah, surprisingly high, very high. Okay, so this is on a different topic. We don't have the same sorts of questions for environmentalism, but it's an important part of thinking about the food system. So protection of the environment should be given priority, even at the risk of curbing economic growth. And this number, I should just go and show it, is going to be high at 62%. But the reason this is interestingly high is a little less obvious. In the US, the economy and jobs are the most important hot button political issue. We talk about a lot of other things. We talk about healthcare. We talk about I could name all sorts of provocative issues, but most people are concerned about, are they getting good work or not? Have they lost their job recently, et cetera? That drives a lot of political motion in the US. So this, even at the risk of curbing economic growth, I think the fact that people are moving past that and still prioritizing the environment is really compelling. Okay, so I'll put these into context, but to return briefly, scale, neglect, and intractability. Okay, so scale of causes is the first thing to think about. Just what is the issue? What is at stake? I don't actually have to go through this much anymore. Again, when I first started giving these sorts of talks, not on the book and not when we had that data, but maybe around 2014, I really had to teach people a lot more about what was going on factory farms. But there are over 100 billion animals on factory farms around the world. Many of them are small animals like chickens and fish, because you have to raise many more of them for the same amount of calories. Many of them are kept on these sort of battery cages. Actually, a big thing that I was just at an event about yesterday was the fact that you've had commitments by a lot of US companies to take hens out of these cages. And companies have said, we're going to make these changes, and they haven't. So if you look like new farms being built, if you go out and actually just try to go to some chicken farms, I've been to several in California, you will still see battery cages. In fact, I'm not going to show you, but I'm in a big living room right now, and there's a big dog kennel where we have one of our 2 hens, the other passed away last year, who were rescued from battery cage farms in California. Even when those were illegal, they were still in battery cages. And that was the law. These are also corporate policy changes that we're considering. So these animals, hens, for example, lay over 300 jumbo-sized eggs a year. In nature, they lay about 15. They're much smaller. This really wreaks havoc on their reproductive system. Again, to talk about the 2 hens that we rescued, Snow and Duala, they're on implants. So they've been on something similar to what in humans keeps humans from reproducing infertility drugs. It keeps them from producing eggs because otherwise they'll die within a few years of being born. It's really a tragic way that we've bred them to have such overactive reproductive systems. For animals we farm for their meat, they grow so much muscle that they often have heart attacks. They often collapse on farms and die before their time, and they're killed at so early in their lifespan. Chicken raised for meat might be killed at 42 days. That they're able to still survive and still be profitable, even though they go through such intense suffering. If you want to think about like evolutionary pressure and how would these things persist. So I won't go into more detail because I think a lot of you are probably already familiar with that, but the scale is very large. I'm going to talk about this more with AI, but we should also think about the future. So as humanity grows, both on Earth, as population grows, as it persists through time, we might be at the very beginning of the human species. And as we expand to the stars, which I think we will, we should be really mindful of our misbehavior as a species and the suffering we've caused. And I think the stakes become astronomical when we think about this sort of suffering. There are also environmental harms. This is an alien world that's actually just a feedlot. That's algae and pollution in the waste that's being dumped into the middle of this. You can see around these edges are the individual blocks where I believe these are cows would be held. I think this is in the US as well. Again, I used to give these talks before COVID and talked about pandemic risk and antibiotic resistance. And we're a lot more aware of these now. Whether we've gotten our act together is less clear, but factory farms are a huge contributor to public health risks. This includes in the local vicinity of factory farms. I don't know where everyone is. I grew up from a very rural town in the South. We would have communities that were around a feedlot, and we get a lot of pollution in the air, have higher rates of asthma and things like that, in addition to global issues. Of course, an environmental elephant in the room, more greenhouse gas emissions from animal agriculture than the entire transportation sector, around 14.5%. There's some estimates you might see online that go up to as high as 50%. I think those are wrong, but there's a rich debate around these exact numbers, and a lot of it depends on how you count it. So for example, do you count every single input that's going into animal agriculture, like the metal steel post production for the fences around the cows or something like that? But nonetheless, it's an extremely large issue and very important for not just the animal's health, but human health as well. Okay, so less obvious things, neglectedness. So a tiny percentage of the donations that go towards farm animals, this has changed a bit recently, but it's still in this ballpark, goes towards animals used for food. Most of it goes towards the dogs and cats in our home. A bit goes towards charismatic megafauna. Think of tigers, elephants out in the wild. Very little that goes towards farmed animals, and even less within farmed animals goes towards the most numerous farmed animals. So again, it takes around 200 chickens to produce the same number of calories of meat as it would a cow, which means a lot more of them are suffering. It's also biologically easier to keep them in tiny environments and things like this. Actually, most cows still begin their lives out on pasture because that's more efficient. But for chickens, it's most efficient to just keep them in these really miserable spaces their entire lives. So those are even more neglected. Fish are extremely neglected. One exciting group that I think Arden and I were discussing is Shrimp Welfare Project. So shrimp, these really tiny creatures that are so adorable, they're used in such huge numbers and nobody's thinking about their welfare. So that might be really neglected and really important, even though they're tiny creatures, because they're still seem to be sentient. They still seem to have the sort of experience that makes them morally valuable. And so few people are focusing on them. I think that's a really important part of effective altruism is thinking about those groups that are most oppressed and most neglected. And one thing you get here, as I said, this graph is changing over time, and issues like public health are coming more into the landscape. If you start working on these issues, these are tomorrow's social issues. So it's not the sort of issues that you hear about most in the news today and might fade away and we make a lot of progress on in the next decade. They're the issues that you need to work on to seed the discussion around animal welfare, for example. That's going to be happening 20, 30 years from now, sort of when you're in, let's say, the peak of your career. Okay, so tractability, and I want to put those statistics into context. Social change can happen incredibly quickly, and I think that's what I was saying with this latent, power, this potential energy that we see in social systems. So these are just various bands that have changed in the U.S. Over the period from 1787 to 2015. I don't know of a more updated graph, but we can see lots of things. Obviously, there's been some later sudden social changes in the other direction, like with Roe v. Wade. But in general, progressive social movements tend to have this period of very slow change, and then they spike. And in this case, different states all adopt these rules at the same time, around the 18th or 19th Amendment or something like that, or more recently, Obergefell versus Hodges. And these are, for example, same-sex marriage. That last one's recreational marijuana, which obviously has had a lot of changes since then as well. So I think there's evidence of tractability for helping these animals from historical social movements like these, a lot of experimental and behavioral science evidence from marketing and social psychology and those sorts of fields, and existing project and animal advocacy. This is an area that effective altruists have been focused on since really 2013. So I was part of the creation of a group called Animal Charity Evaluators that was founded to evaluate different charities, see how impactful they could be, and then try to move money towards them so they could do more good for animals. And that is part of what led to these, cage-free egg campaigns, for example, and a lot of success, obviously a long way to go, as well as developments in food technology, for example, that I'll talk about in a moment. So I think there are reasons for optimism. When we look at the long-term trajectory of the food system, when we think about tractability, when we think about what we can accomplish. We talked about the moral circle very briefly. So this is one visualization of the moral circle from a psychology experiment. So this is looking at a bunch of different groups, family and friends, your social in-group, revered groups like veterans, stigmatized groups, out groups that are distant from you, high sentience animals, the environment, arguably low sentience animals like chickens, plants, and villains, people who have committed some egregious wrong. And you can kind of see them just spaced out here further and further away on our moral circle. So as we see this slow accretion of moral and social progress over time, we're getting further and further out. A lot of these initial rights movements, beginning with, let's say, anti-slavery in the 1600s, would have started with just concern for people in the in-group, maybe people in some stigmatized populations, human out-groups. And then we started having animal rights discussions, mainly in the 1900s, but actually a lot of the founders of the anti-slavery movement in the UK, such as William Wilberforce, were some of the leaders of the first animal movements as well. So you can even see within many people's careers how these things start to grow outwards. And I think only now are we really seeing big social change start to happen for the smaller creatures who inhabit this world with us. And this is called the moral expansiveness scale. And it's a really interesting line of research, a lot of it in Australia, but it's taking off, I think, rather quickly in moral and social psychology. Okay, many quotes about progress. This is actually the original quote around the arc of the universe bends towards justice by Theodore Parker. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, and from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice. There are many books on this sort of progress. This is even a new field emerging called progress studies, which is really interesting. So how can we look at this historical social change, both economic, our material, gross domestic product, GDP, things like that, and moral progress, the better angels of our nature, the moral arc. I think really evidencing a lot of positive change that's happened. One of the challenges with effective altruism is you've sort of got to hold several seemingly conflicting beliefs in your head. One of them is that, the world is really bad. I think that's the easiest. Many of us believe that. We have a high bias towards negativity in the news, for example, in social media. But another is that the world has gotten a lot better and things are really, really bad. In Better Angels of Our Nature, they talk about the abuse towards cats in Europe, public sports, things like burning cats for fun, really unconscionable, unimaginable things in today's society that we now see as obviously morally wrong. It's easy to fail to appreciate how much progress we've made. And then the third belief being that the world could get a lot better. Most of these are about some moral arc that's really just beginning. And you're at a very exciting period, all of us are today, where we could be seeing further progress and the fruition of even things like the Enlightenment, where the ideas are there, but now change is propagating throughout society. Okay, I'm going to kind of skip through some of these slides. This is about the inefficiency of animal use. It takes a lot more inputs to create the outputs than it does with plant-based food. This makes sense if you think about it, right? Animals are producing hair, hooves, brains, bones. They're walking around, thinking, feeling. So I think there's an efficiency argument for optimism, where if humans can be counted on for anything, it's getting more for less and trying to make things cheaper. So I think we will see a shift towards plant-based foods for this reason. Also, a lot of food waste that we can get rid of. And you can have your cow and eat steak too, because you have food technology like the Impossible Burger or Beyond Burger. This guy, Ethan Brown, in the book, I interviewed Ethan Brown, for example, and a really interesting character. Got involved somewhat through environmentalism, but again, saw it has the elephant in the room. Also a lot of, I'll talk about that in a minute. So some of this food technology is really simple. I think people fail to appreciate how much we can do with standard kind of food machinery. So a lot of these plant-based meats are made with something called extrusion. So it's this long tube where you put some plant fiber in one end and pull it, stretch it through and heat and cool it to produce a long fiber. When we think a lot about what makes meat meaty and what we want from it, it's this fibrous, chewy texture. And you can get that from plants using machinery like this. There's also new technology called a couette cell, where you can pull it around a cylinder and stretch it and elongate it in the sort of same way. This is also happening in other places around the world. I interviewed David Young for the book, who did Green Monday in Hong Kong. And they founded a company called Right Treat that's doing products like this Omnipork. So these pork balls are extremely popular in Hong Kong cuisine, made with, I don't want to say local ingredients, but more typical ingredients for the cuisine, peas, soy, shiitake mushrooms, and rice. It's being really successful there. It's sort of an equivalent to the all-American, beef burger in these places. And we see a lot of change, a lot of increase in restaurants, especially in these countries, that haven't had as much of a vegetarianism discussion, but now are taking off, especially when you can appeal to some sort of local or traditional cuisine. One of the interesting things happening in effective altruism right now, I just had a call a couple of days ago with someone who's trying to take rare Chinese tofus. So these sort of special tofus that are very common in China that do things like melt, they're like gooey, like cheese, and bring them to the US. Because when we think of tofu in the US, we think of these homogeneous, white, maybe silken, maybe firm blocks of tofu. And really, there's a lot more to it. And we can bring that in to American cuisine, maybe create a lot of changes. Okay, more optimistic quotes. I think you get the point. Cultured meat might be something you've heard about, self-cultured meat, several companies doing this. It might be made, through real animal cells, through cultivating them in some sort of large tank that looks like, this is actually just, I think, at a beer brewery. Or maybe like cheese and yogurt and dairy, the sort of fermentation process, but making actual animal meat with animal cells. Again, this is one of these things where nobody knew about it when I started giving these talks, but now I think a lot of you are familiar. Right now, a lot of the progress, and in fact, maybe the first sort of career I'll highlight that you could do later in your life would be working on many of these technologies, because they're really exciting, but they're really challenging biologically, and we need really smart people with skills in chemistry and biology and engineering to address these challenges. Because you've got to have good cells, so you've got to create a good cell line from the animals that has the right properties that you want, is of the right animal, and so on and so forth, obviously. Some sort of scaffolding or structure. So when meat grows in our body, it grows around our bones and ligaments, and it's very well structured in a way that creates that fibrous texture, the way extrusion or something might, and it gets the cells to proliferate and grow and create something, a sizable amount of food. They need to be fed something. This is actually a big challenge, because when we try to feed these cells with cell media, so think of the nutrients that are going around in your blood and supplying your body, that gets very expensive very quickly, because right now that industry is mostly a medical industry. So producing things like insulin growth factor, where they're used to making it in small quantities and extremely high purity for medical applications. What we need for food is something more like in our body. It's like a big mix of things. It varies a lot, but it's got everything we need. So a lot of the research is here. In fact, I'd say more research is in cell media and reducing the cost of that than any of the other areas combined. So the last thing is sort of the engineering or the practical or mechanical aspect, if you're more into physics and those disciplines. So this is creating an environment where all of this can come together and produce a final product efficiently. For example, one of the ideas is being able to recycle that media because it's so expensive. So what you haven't used from one batch, sort of piping it around and getting it back into the next batch as you're going through production. Okay, so I want to briefly talk about a bit of the research that happens in this field now. Research is only one way to approach these issues. Again, it's effective altruism is about finding the most pressing problems and then solving them. I'm more on the finding side. But one thing we want to think about is whether we should focus on changing individuals or changing institutions. So on the left is my friend John Camp, a wonderful, very dedicated animal advocate who's handed out over 1 million of these leaflets, persuading people to change their own diets. On the right is a photo from the Arab Spring, so people changing institutions in that different movement through radical public demonstrations and political action. So in the context of farmed animals, individual change might be things like go vegan or handing out leaflets or online ads. It's more of what we in sociology would call a lifestyle movement. Institutional change would be saying things like we need to end our reliance on factory farming, policy change, movement building, bringing people together in a coherent, burgeoning social movement, and building new technologies, and then of course founding startups and things like that. And I think this is the most important research conclusion in this field of effective animal advocacy or effective altruism for animals for several reasons. One is that there's a lot of evidence from history. So I know of no movement in the entire history of humanity that has succeeded with the focus on individual change that we see in the farm animal movement. There's just a lot more precedent for this, including, as I mentioned, anti-slavery. We've got a big report on that on our website. It was a really foundational movement where I think we can learn a lot. And they had something called a free produce movement in the US. So this was people individually abstaining from slave-made goods. And I don't think it was very effective. In fact, a lot of people in the movement switched away from it and started, renouncing it as an ineffective strategy to end slavery, and instead switched towards more institutional approaches. Moral outrage. So when you frame a problem as being done by society as a whole or being done by these corporations, that can get people a lot more excited about it because they're able to feel moral outrage, to feel deep indignation at these problems in a way that they don't if instead you're making them defensive by critiquing their own individual diet. And I think this is a really big mistake that the farm animal movement has made, is not utilizing this moral outrage that's so important in so many movements, like, again, the Arab Spring, for example, or these big movements in the US that we've seen more recently, like Women's March and Science March, things like that. It utilizes social pressure. Humans don't change very easily individually. Individuals are sometimes weird and make big changes in their own diet or consumption or identity. Very few of them do that. Like, just the fact that you're interested in these topics already means that you're a bit unusual in the world, in a very good way, but in a way that means that you're not your audience. You might have heard that. It's very common marketing advice. You're not your audience. You shouldn't trust your own intuitions. You should do things like run surveys to know whether people will like your idea if you're starting a business or anything like that. Bringing people together, having them collaborate, having them utilize herd behavior, all of that is very effective. Okay, I won't really talk about this, but we did a case study of genetically modified organisms to look at why that technology failed to take off. So actually, the way that genetic modification started in the 70s and 80s was really a humanitarian focus. These scientists were, hey, we've got these pressing food issues, but we have things like the Green Revolution and Norman Borlaug, where we can create really big change by improving the food that we eat, by making it grow faster, by making it grow in more environments, by sharing it with low-income people around the world. And they thought that GMOs could do that. But then that movement largely failed in many ways. It's more successful in the US than it was in Europe. But what can we learn from its successes and from its failure? One thing is the importance of ethics. So they really failed when they weren't focused on this moral upshot, not just price, taste, and convenience. When the rhetoric's based on that, it's really easy to be pushed back against, to be fought against by moral groups. So a lot of this discourse was Monsanto and these big agricultural or even pharmaceutical corporations pushing for these new technologies, and then environmentalists and health advocates pushing against them on the other side. And that's a really hard battle to win in the public's eyes, because one side's moral and one side's not. But if instead we focus on morality around these food technologies and keep it focused on the animals and the environment and our health, I think that can be a lot more effective. Happy to talk more at any point about some of our case studies. So to sort of wrap up this first discussion on animals, and then I'll spend the last 20 minutes on AI. This is a roadmap that the book sort of lays out. Right now, we're laying the foundation still. We're doing things like working in those technologies. I think we'll start to see really rapid change in the coming years. A lot of this is because you get positive feedback loops where food's getting cheaper, therefore more people are eating it, therefore it has more economies of scale, if you've heard of that. So when more people are consuming a product, you're able to reduce prices. Let's say you're able to buy machinery for cheaper, or even produce your own machinery and other inputs into your economic process. Then it'll become stigmatized to even keep farming animals. And then we'll see follow through where everywhere in the world gets these new technologies as I think wealth and things are set to increase. And there'll be a lot more variegation in the industry where it can appeal to all sorts of local cuisines. Adam asks, what is your opinion of GMOs? I won't go into much detail on I'm not an expert on like the sort of moral evaluation of GMOs. I study them more as a social scientist on what's been effective and what's not. But I would say that I've seen examples like golden rice, of this vitamin-enriched food that is really struggling to be shared with the people who really need it. It could benefit them a lot, and I find that very sad. I think, just like other technologies, there are ways to use it for good and ways to use it for evil. For example, sometimes GMOs have been used to make people reliant on certain crops or on certain companies to get their seeds. I think that's been bad, but I think there's so many good examples that clearly we've neglected a lot of the potential of GMOs. So I'm curious for your opinion too. Feel free to throw it in there. Okay. But the future and really where my work is focused on is stage 5. So what happens after the end of this century? How does the moral circle continue or not continue to expand? I think there are all sorts of other areas where we need moral progress. So for example, wild animals, I won't talk about them today, but there are far more wild animals than farmed animals in the world. And I think they really need our help too. We're causing a lot of harm to the wildlife on this planet, not just the animals in our homes or not just the animals on farms. I think, I'll talk more about other things when it comes to AI. So I'm a long-termist. I think that the long-term future is a moral priority. This has been an undercurrent of effective altruism throughout its history. 25 years is definitely a simplification. I do think these are like ballpark, right? So my guess would be that by 2050, over 50% of meat, dairy, and eggs in high-income countries will be plant-based. This is all from the book in 2018, and we've seen some challenges like COVID that have really knocked the knees out of some of these new companies, for example. So perhaps my timeline's a little longer now, but I think it's the right ballpark. And I do think there are these sorts of phases because of those things like feedback loops. So I think they're pretty non-linear, as we'd say, but it's just a ballpark. So one thing I talk about a lot is both earlier social movements and what they've required and earlier technologies. So for example, it used to be that social movements would take a very long time because ideas diffused very slowly. So for anti-slavery or even in the early 1900s, various social movements like early US civil rights took a long time to just share the ideas across the whole country, to get everyone together, to meet, things like that. Social change can happen a lot faster now. And technological change can happen very fast. If we look at the adoption of cell phones or the adoption of personal computers, those have happened very quickly, or how new social media apps take off compared to something like the telephone itself or television or radio or older technologies. And that's speeding up. I think it has the potential for things like economies of scale because it has these market mechanisms. So there's a lot to go into. Okay. Final question, then I'll move forward. If tech progress is speeding up this century, do you think moral progress will as well? Yes, definitely. So there's definitely a feedback loop here. If people are no longer eating animals 3 times a day, their moral attitudes change. There are experiments, for example, where you bring people into the lab as a psychologist and say, hey, you're going to eat, I think this particular study I have in mind was beef jerky. So you're going to eat an animal product, and they tell some people that, and then they've got a control group where they don't tell them anything like that, or they tell them they're going to eat some apples or something. And the group that knows that they're going to eat animals estimates that animals are less intelligent than the group that is not going to eat animals. So sort of the way we eat actually changes the way we think about animals, because we now have an interest in what their mental life looks like. So I think it's a good exercise to sort of remove yourself from that and think about, appreciating these animals for who they are, because they are really intelligent, sapient, sentient creatures. Okay, so long-termism for animals, I think, is extremely important. Thinking about both how we end factory farming and animal farming in the long run, and thinking about what happens after that. You might have seen some figures like this if you've heard about long-termism. So this is an hourglass made by Our World and Data. They've got a lot of really great visualizations online, where each grain of sand is 10 million people, and these are people being born every year. And here's the number of people alive today, and here's the size of our past. So it's good to think of ourselves in the scope of this whole human project. But what that tees up is the next visualization, which is the future. So these are the next children who will be born, the next 8 billion, about who's alive today, who will be born at the very beginning, I guess the second little entry there, maybe the first. And then there's 1,000 generations from now, but the long-term future of humanity could be extremely large. If we don't go extinct as a species, if we colonize our solar system or other planets outside of it, we could really be at the very beginning. And when you look at sort of the scope of what you think all civilizations would look like, we're at a very unique place, because we've got a lot of future ahead of us compared to that limited amount of past. And I think that's a very exciting opportunity, and it's very unique. View. Light speed barrier. We don't have to cross the light speed barrier in any way to have incredibly large futures. I think it is a fact of our physics that we live in that you can't cross the speed of light. It's like one of the most established points about physics. I think there are interesting questions around things like causality and whether we can do a causal trade. Sorry, this is a super deep end, so I'm only going to say it very briefly. But ways in which we can interact with things outside of the light cone, things beyond the light speed barrier. Thanks for the link to the video. That don't require us to actually physically move faster than the speed of light. Of course, there are also ideas like, fold space around you. That's not theoretically impossible, because you're not actually moving at the speed of light. You're just bending the universe itself. I'm not a physicist. I have opinions on some things in physics, but I'm not an expert on that one, so I'll avoid further comment. But I think we should be cautious long-termists. So I think that future is extremely important, but we should make sure that the future we would build is one worth living in. So that both leads me to focus on animal advocacy, as well as other areas like AI safety, to ensure that we do well with the resources we have available, we treat others well, we build a better future, not just ensure that the future exists. These images, as you can tell from the little boxes in the bottom right, are from DALL-E. So these are both made by an AI. I think I put in something like a cartoon image of an owl looking down at a worm, and a cartoon image of a worm sitting in the ground and grass. If you haven't seen how impressive these AIs are, you definitely should check that out. I think a lot of people have seen these news stories. But these are very dangerous, and they have potential to cause a lot of problems. Adam, I will defer the sentience question to a few slides later. So safety is very hard. It's very hard to get these systems to treat everyone well. One reason is that they're very delicate or brittle. So this is an example where just a sign flip. So these researchers were trying to build safe chemicals. They were trying to build pharmaceuticals and make sure they were non-toxic. They did as little harm as possible to the human body. And they just flipped the sign on that. So they just said, oh, let's turn that around and try to make them maximally toxic drugs or pharmaceuticals. And it ended up coming up with nerve gas and all sorts of other chemical weapons. Obviously, just theoretically, it didn't actually build them, but it's very easy to do something like flip a sign in these functions. Between AI and animal agriculture, I'll get to that briefly, as well as the sentience question. But for now, just think of them as two important areas of effective altruism, especially representing a really important problem today, and then a really important problem for the future. They can go crazy in various ways. So this is an example of from OpenAI, a group again in the Bay. having faulty reward functions. So the idea is this ship playing this game, if you've played Mario Kart or anything, it looks like this, found that it could get lots of points from power-ups. So instead of completing the race, it just spun around, picking up these power-ups repeatedly as efficiently as possible as soon as they're spawned in. A pretty silly thing, but the designers didn't intend this. They were just trying to get it to maximize points, get it to go around as quickly as possible. So they guys said, hey, you get, I don't know, 5 points if you get a power up. But it found a really efficient way to exploit that. And in general, it's really hard to tell these AIs what we want to do without getting weird outcomes. These images, again, incredible from, I think these are Stable Diffusion. You might have also heard of Midjourney. Really impressive stuff. I imagine most of y'all have seen something like this before. This is actually an old slide. So these are somewhat outdated methods, but even a few years ago, we could still do really impressive things like change images from day to night, like change horses to zebras, like make people who are the original video, she is not dancing. He's a professional dancer. And it's detecting his pose and mapping it onto her body. So now she is a professional. I actually don't know what sort of dancing that is. That's a tool called Everybody Dance Now. But really impressive work. Alexei Efros actually sold this slide from him because he spoke here at Chicago a few days ago. Okay, I'll skip that, but that's some beautiful poetry written by an AI. Most people can't tell which of these is written by an AI, but one of them is. It turns out that it's this one that was written by an AI. Okay, so I'm gonna skip. Well, I'll pose this problem. Okay, so when we talk about the alignment problem, when we talk about AI safety, what we're talking about is the fact that it's extremely hard to tell AI what we want it to do, even in incredibly simple scenarios. So let's say that you're like Mickey Mouse in the Disney movie Fantasia, and you have an advanced AI system like magic. Magic is sort of an advanced AI, and you want to fill a cauldron. So you want this broomstick to fill up water into this cauldron, and you want it to do what you actually want it to do. What command would you give it? Well, the way that this is canonically approached in AI is to give it some sort of utility function. So to say you get a utility of 1 if it's full, a utility of 0 if it's not full. You get points, essentially. This would cause problems. If this was all you gave a super intelligence to tell it to fill this up, it would keep it full, but it would do that at the cost of other things. So it would probably kill everyone. It would ensure that nobody ever empties this cauldron because it wants it to be at a 1 forever and with certainty. So if nobody is around to ever empty that cauldron, it's done its job really well because you gave it a utility function. You gave it a point scoring system that was too narrow. And you could think of various ways to get around this, such as giving it a penalty for affecting the outside world. You lose 5 points if you mess with anything outside of this room. Affecting the outside world is a really hard thing to operationalize. So it would probably try to minimize change in the world. What it doesn't want to do is affect anything. So it doesn't want things to change. And to do that, it might make the entire world inanimate, freeze everyone in place, kill all living things, so on and so forth, in a really dangerous way. And I should say that this is like obviously a caricatured example, but you go through these sort of things, like you try to give it an off switch. Well, what's it going to do? It's going to keep you from pressing that off switch. You try to get it to, this is a bit complicated, but optimize for multiple episodes. So consider that it's going to have to be given this task again and again. So if it kills you, it's not going to be able to get one utility in the next iteration of the game. It might deceive you in this case into thinking that it's safe and having you continue running the game. Maybe you want to just tell the AI, do what I want. And this is actually a somewhat natural approach to this based on these new language models where you can give them text and give them a broad task, give them a question from the SAT or the ACT, for example. And they're very good at those now, or they're getting a lot better, at least for those tests. They're still struggling with a lot of tests like Math Olympiad stuff, but they're on their way there. But you give it some natural language instruction, sort of ask it, do what I want you to do, whatever that is. This is the approach of alignment. So maybe those are the magic words. And this sort of AI safety problem is a lot of thinking around what instructions can we give AI that are safe. But the existential question is, how do we do this in a way that doesn't lead to one of these weird outcomes, especially given that anything people have come up with today, that's an actual concrete instruction, leads to some perverse instantiation like these. Okay, I'll skip through the other examples. I mentioned here Goodhart's law. So Goodhart's law is really interesting. It's that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. So the idea is if you tell somebody, do really well on this test and you give them all of the test questions, that will no longer be a good measure of what the test was intended to measure at the beginning. This is called teaching to the test in US discourse, and it is a critique of a lot of standardized testing. Where could you go to learn more about this? If you look up AI safety, you can find a lot. You look up AI alignment in Google. I can give you specific links, but for now, they're pretty easy to find. Okay, so is it hopeless? You might have seen this movie, Don't Look Up, where, again, in the climate movement, we've often thought, well, we're obviously headed towards catastrophe and nobody listens to us. Like in this movie, they sort of ignore the environmental advocates. This is a graph of people assessing how likely artificial general intelligence is to come soon, not soon versus soon, and how likely it is to destroy all future value, but cause some sort of global catastrophe. And in this case, I'm right here in the middle. So I'm actually pretty close to average, I guess. I'm not too pessimistic, not too optimistic, but the numbers here are, this is a 0 to 5% chance, and this is 90% chance or more. And there are a lot of people down here. So even if there's some small chance of things really going wrong, I mean, things are already starting to go wrong in a lot of ways. We've got a lot of biased algorithms. We've got autonomous weapons, a lot of problems. This is still a cause for concern. It's one very few people are focused on. So I think environmentalism is very important. Climate change is very important. I don't think it's as neglected as something like AI safety. I think that artificial general intelligence will come within our lifetimes. If you've heard of Wait But Why, Tim Urban's blog, it's a great one, but it talks about how human intelligence is really just a blip on the entire scope of intelligence possibilities. So the difference between, dumb human, which maybe that's where a lot of AIs are now. I mean, AI performance is better than humans in many ways. Like if you're giving an AI a passage of text and trying to predict what's the next word that a human would write, AIs are far, far better at this than any human is. That might be a small jump to Einstein or to general intelligence in some way. And we seem to be right at this cusp. So a lot of people, if you look at a website called Metaculus, that's a lot of predictions about the future. So predictions about when artificial general intelligence will come, for example, a lot of people think it's going to come very quickly. I think that's really important. And again, not many people are working on it, despite it coming within our lifetimes. There's a lot of, there are abstract reasons. So AI can improve itself. That's very unique among technologies. Some things like nuclear weapons and biological weapons were really dangerous. Even things like social media algorithms are dangerous in a lot of ways, but they don't improve upon themselves. A social media algorithm doesn't create social media algorithms. An AI can create AIs. That's very unique as a technology. And I think both a cause for a lot of excitement and a lot of concern and a reason to work on it and try to improve the future. There are surveys of researchers. There's investment in AI. There are a lot more patents coming out. These are just until 2021. I know that's small font, but very challenging maybe for some people in high school. Everything's fine. Thanks, Keshav. But I think they're good books to start looking at and try to wade through. I think I can tell you all are an impressive crowd, so I think you can handle them. Brian Christian, actually, Stuart Russell and Brian Christian were just here in Chicago a couple weeks ago for a conference on these topics that I hosted. So how can we steer this transformation? There are a lot of approaches. So this is like the technical things that you could actually work on. There are things like teaching AIs to debate each other, to find the truth in ways that make it safer. So you can have them argue about whether this is an image of a dog or of a cat. This is called AI safety through debate. You can look at how humans debate and try to extract lessons from that to make AI safer. You can try to look at the interpretability of models, so try to understand what's happening inside of these models that can do such crazy, impressive things. So this is looking at the feature detectors inside of a car detector. So the way that it sees windows, it sees the body of the car, it sees the wheels, and it puts all those together to see a car. It's a tiny, tiny example, but they're working on doing this for more sophisticated models. Doing this for language models, we call these transformers. Trying to look at their various features, such as how they predict later text. You can see we use examples like this is Harry Potter text, how it predicts people's names from when it's seen their names before. And I'll skip through some of the other stuff, but then jump to AI sentience since people are asking about that, and that's also what I work on. So the idea here is there are many reasons to think that the minds of the future, the humans of the future, the people, even the animals of the future, will be digital instead of biological. So there are many advantages to augmenting yourself or to living in some digital way. One of them, for example, is that you can modify yourself. So if you're a robot or if you're a computer program, you can edit your own code. And that seems really advantageous in the long run. Another would be that you don't have sort of biological decay, and humans have always sought, the fountain of youth. And we're seeing more and more of these. You might have seen earlier this year, a Google engineer, Blake Lemoine, claimed that their model Lambda, their language model, was sentient. And we're going to start seeing minds in AIs more, and they're starting to start developing their own minds more. And this stream of research is trying to make sure that goes well for any sentient AIs and for humans, obviously. So really outside of the moral circle are digital minds at this point. And I know we're at 3 p.m., Arden. Do I need to stop immediately or?
No, I think it's okay. People might trickle out because of other club meetings starting, but yeah, if you're free, definitely feel free to continue.
Cool. I'll just go through this section and then we can discuss a bit. So there are lots of examples in science fiction of digital minds. WALL-E, this is from iRobot. Data from Star Trek is one of the most famous ones. There's a great, if you like old sci-fi, Measure of a Man is a great episode where this robot is evaluated on whether he has the rights of a human. Yeah, thanks, Allison, for coming. Battlestar Galactica, Robin Williams, who passed away not long ago, was in an old movie called Bicentennial Man. This is a science fiction short story by, if you've seen the movie Arrival, about like alien language, aliens coming down. He was actually also at our conference a few weeks ago. Thanks, Audrey, for coming. He wrote a book about software as sort of like Tamagotchi or like Neopets. I don't know if there's an equivalent for kids these days, but these were a thing when I was a kid. Okay, so we ask questions like, when will the first digital sentience emerge, and how will humans react to it as AI starts to take off? What sort of digital minds will exist in the medium and long-term futures? What kind of a society will digital people live in? And what strategies and policies can best facilitate good futures with digital minds, including appropriate consideration of their moral interests? So I think these are really important and neglected questions. We work on them at Sentience Institute. There's a group called Future of Humanity Institute, as well as some others who are working on these topics. This is a very new field. We're really focused on seeding and starting the conversation, publishing in academic journals on the topic. We ran the first US nationally representative survey that asks in detail questions about this. So I think, again, in effective altruism, you'll find these new areas that nobody's really thought about before that we need to start thinking about, and that I think within a decade or two are going to be very mainstream topics to work on. The same way effective altruists were working on animal advocacy almost a decade ago now, and working on AI even 2 decades ago, some of the sort of proto-EA communities. And now those are such important topics. I think these are really what we're going to be working on in the future. Here's the examples from our survey. We've done other experiments on it. So just to recap everything I've talked about, I know this has been a whirlwind and I appreciate y'all listening. Effective altruism aims to identify the world's most large and most tractable problems and to solve them. The first of those problems that I highlighted is animal advocacy. A lot of these animals suffering on factory farms, and we can approach that with policy, with technology, and with activism. We live in a very unique time. Transformative AI is I think coming relatively soon. And I think y'all are at a very unique opportunity to take the lead on that and be, the leaders in the same way that when the Industrial Revolution happened, there were people who were theorizing that and understanding it and trying to make sure it goes well. Whether they succeeded is a bit unclear, but I think this is kind of going to be one of the defining issues of the 21st century. If I had to give, recommendations, I'd say that community is key, being a part of groups, thinking more about these issues, talking more about these issues. There's a huge global community emerging, working on all of this. Expect change. When I talk to a lot of young people and when I look back at my own career and those of my colleagues, we thought our careers would be a lot more straightforward than they would be. Again, I've jumped from animals to AI as a topic. Many people make even bigger changes than that. Specializing is good. So a lot of people bounce around things a little too much. Building specialization can be good. Just be willing to expect that change. I think, if you're thinking about college majors, for example, they can all be useful. There's a role for all of them. I'm actually pretty unique in being a sociologist in effective altruism, but I'm now working on, math and statistical research. I started on that in 2020. So there's still time to change even at that late stage, but I do think STEM subjects tend to be more neglected. Sometimes they're harder for people, so there are fewer people working on them, and really have a lot of leverage on many of these most important issues like food technology and artificial intelligence. And I had some links here, but I know we put a lot in the chat. There's a newsletter with 80,000 hours. There's a Get Involved page at Sentience Institute that actually just, there's our newsletter there. We don't send out much on it. 80,000 hours sends out a lot more. I'm on Twitter if anybody wants to follow that. There's some summer programs around effective altruism and rationality. LEAF courses is based in the UK, if anyone's there. I'm not sure if next year they're going to be UK only. This is actually co-led by a former researcher at Sentience Institute. And here's one of the fun images that I produced with DALL-E 2. Very fun new tools. And of course, join your university chapter, or if you're not going to college, there are local groups in a ton of US cities and most big global cities as well. Thanks, everyone.